Part 2. How the brain develops and how the circuits and chemistry of ADD rise. Chapter 6. Different Worlds. Heredity and the Environments of Childhood. A genetic fundamentalism permeates public awareness these days. It may be summed up as the belief that almost every illness and every human trait is dictated by heredity. Simplified media accounts, culled by semi-digested research findings, have declared that inflexible laws of DNA rule the biological world. It was reported in 1996 that according to some psychologists, genes determine about 50% of a person's inclination to experience happiness. Social ability and obesity are two more among the many human qualities now claimed to be genetic. Each week brings the discovery of a gene that is associated with some disease or trait, noted a tongue-in-cheek contributor to the New York Times. With thousands yet to be discovered, you can just imagine what is out there or in there. The line dancing gene, the loves British cuisine gene, the tendency to go on TV talk shows and embrace yourself gene. True or not, narrow genetic explanations for ADD and every other condition of the mind do have their attractions. They are easy to grasp, socially conservative, and psychologically soothing. They raise no uncomfortable questions about how a society and culture might erode the health of its members, or about how life in a family may have affected a person's physiology or emotional makeup. As I have personally experienced, feelings of guilt are almost inevitable for parents of a troubled child. They are all too frequently reinforced by the uninformed judgments of friends, neighbors, teachers, or even total strangers on the bus or in the supermarket. Parental guilt, even if misplaced, is a wound for which the genetic hypothesis offers a balm. There is significant hereditary contributions to ADD. Sensitivity, subject of the next chapter, but I do not believe any genetic factor is decisive in the emergence of ADD traits in any child. Genes are codes for the synthesis of the proteins that give a particular cell its characteristic structure and function. They are, as it were, alive and dynamic architectural and mechanical plans. Whether the plan becomes realized depends on far more than the gene itself. It is determined, for the most part, by the environment. To put it differently, genes carry potentials inherent in the cells of a given organism. Which of multiple potentials become expressed biologically is a question of life's circumstances. Were we to adopt the medical model, only temporarily, for the sake of argument, a genetic explanation by itself would still be unsuitable. Medical conditions for which genetic inheritance are fully or even mostly responsible, such as muscular dystrophy, are rare. Few diseases are purely genetic, says Michael Hayden, a geneticist at the University of British Columbia and a world-renowned researcher into Huntington's disease. The most we can say is that some diseases are strongly genetic. Huntington's is a fatal degeneration of the nervous system based on a single gene that, if inherited, will almost invariably cause the disease. But not always. Dr. Hayden mentions cases of persons with a gene who live into ripe old age without any signs of the disease itself. Even in Huntington's, there must be some protective factor in the environment, Dr. Hayden says. Genes can be activated or turned off by factors in the environment. In the Cree population of northwestern Ontario, for example, diabetes is found at a rate 5 times the Canadian national average, despite the traditionally low incidence of diabetes among Native peoples. The genetic makeup of the Cree people cannot have changed in a few generations. The destruction of the Cree's traditional physically active ways of life, the substitution of high-calorie diets for their previous low-fat, low-carbohydrate eating patterns, and greatly increased stress levels are responsible for the alarming rise in diabetes rates. Although heredity is involved in diabetes, it cannot possibly account for the pandemic among Canada's Native peoples. or among the rest of the North American population. We will see that in similar ways, changes in society are causing more and more children to be affected by attention deficit disorder. It is easy to jump to hasty conclusions about genetic information. Some studies have identified certain genes, for example, that are said to be more common among people with attention deficit disorder or with other related conditions, such as depression, alcoholism, or addiction. But even if the existence of these genes is proven, there is no reason to suppose that they can, or on their own, induce the development of ADD or any other disorder. First, not everyone with these genes will have the disorders. Second, not everyone with the disorders will be shown to carry the genes. Studies do show that if parents or siblings have ADD, a child in that family will have a greatly increased statistical risk for having ADD as well. ADD is also found more commonly in people whose first-degree relatives are alcoholics or suffer from depression, anxiety, addiction, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or Tourette's syndrome. It may appear from such facts that this motley collection of related syndromes is largely hereditary, but to assume that would be like believing that if there are 3 generations of butchers, or bakers or candlestick makers in a family, then meat cutting, baking, and candle manufacturing must also be genetic. The family atmosphere in which the child spends the early formative years has a major impact on brain development. It is obvious that brain-mind problems, such as ADD, are far more likely to develop in families where the parents are struggling with dysfunction or psychological problems of their own. It would be astonishing if children growing up in such unsettled environments did not develop some of the same problems. No genes need be involved at all for these conditions to run in families. There has been an enduring misconception in psychological studies that comparing identical twins adopted by different families can separate out genetic effects from environmental ones. Because identical twins adopted by different parents are brought up under different circumstances, any similarities in personality traits are assumed to be due to the shared heredity. Any differences in character are thought to be caused by differences of environment. This misbelief has heavily influenced the conventional understanding of attention deficit disorder. It has shown, for example, that if one of the twin pair has ADD, there is a 50 to 60% likelihood that the other will have it as well. The technical term for this likelihood is concordance. Such a high degree of concordance is taken to prove heredity causation, but only if one ignores the most obvious question. Since identical twins have exactly the same genes, why is the concordance not closer to 100%? Also, ignored is a powerful environmental factor, the adoption itself. A consistently available nurturing caregiver is a fundamental need of the human infant. Adoption means separation from the birth mother to whose body, voice, heartbeat, and biorhythms a newborn is attuned by the time of birth. We cannot simply discount the devastating effect such separation may have on the impressionable nervous system of the infant. Not a few adoptions, including a significant number of the adoptions examined in published studies, take place several months or longer after birth. Many adoptee infants must endure several changes of caregiver without any single, consistently reliable mothering figure to provide them with a constant, safe relationship. Given that emotional security is an absolute human need in infancy, it is astonishing that adoption is so often forgotten as possibly a crucial influence. It is also a fact, as a number of adoptive mothers have told me, that even when a newborn adopted at birth is welcomed into a family with the greatest joy and goodwill, some time may have to pass before the truly symbiotic, two-way, psychologically and emotionally attuned relationship is established between the mother and infant. Everything being equal, this process is smoother when the mother has herself carried the child within her body for 9 months. There is another environment that adopted twins have shared: 9 months in the same uterus. Stress on the mother during pregnancy can unbalance the levels of hormones in her body, particularly of the stress hormone cortisol. Both during and after intrauterine life, cortisol directly affects the developing nervous system. The vast majority of pregnancies ending in adoption occur in mothers under severe stress. They are often unwanted pregnancies, many in teenage girls facing enormous personal, family, and social pressures. Infants, twins or single, who are adopted out are likely to have been exposed to high levels of stress hormones throughout the 9 months of gestation, a negative influence on their developing brains even before birth. For such reasons, we can expect all adopted children to be at unusually high risk for psychological problems in general, ADD in particular, without any recourse to genetic explanations. Such is the case. Any health professional working with ADD cases is struck by the large proportion of clients, children or adults, who were adopted in early childhood. A 1982 study found that the rate of adoption among ADD patients in the clinical population was 8 to 16 times the prevalence of adopted children in the population at large. If you have ADD, you have a far higher than average chance of having been adopted. None of this is to say that all babies are born alike, or that there are no important inborn differences in neurological systems from one infant to the next. Mothers report being aware of some characteristic features in the personalities of their babies right from birth, or even before. Some infants, for example, may have been more difficult to arouse, others to quiet down. Some may be extremely sensitive, others relatively insensitive to environmental stimuli such as noise or touch. Stanley Greenspan calls these patterns of reactivity. In his 1997 volume, The Growth of the Mind, Dr. Greenspan observes that the same combination of biological traits, the very same pattern of reactivity, can come to embody many positive human qualities, or even severe as the basis of highly disturbed characteristics, or may serve as the basis of highly disturbed characteristics. Whether these features become talents or problems depends, in short, on how the child's nature is nurtured. He writes, "The critical difference is the environments in which children are reared." A view of ADD that recognizes the importance of the environment is inherently optimistic. If environmental causes are largely responsible for a problem, perhaps environmental approaches can be employed to help resolve it. When we come to the chapters dealing with the treatment of attention deficit disorder, we will see that long-term positive changes are indeed possible, based on changing the environments of children and even of adults. A dramatic illustration of how environment shapes personality is the story of the Gilmore family. On January 17, 1978, in Utah, the convicted double murderer Gary Gilmore was executed by firing squad, his unyielding refusal to appeal his death sentence having gained him a measure of international notoriety. The shattering story of his childhood, blighted by family violence, alcoholism, and spite, was chronicled later by his brother Michael Gilmore in the memoir, Shot in the Dark. Michael, the youngest of 4 boys, was born when Gary was 11 years old. If children reared in the same family shared the same environment, the differences between siblings would have to be due to genetic inheritance. In the case of the Gilmores, It is easy to see why Michael, born at a time when the family was enjoying a period of relative stability, would feel he had been brought up in a different world. Why the misery of his childhood, as he put it, had been so radically different from the misery of his brother's childhood. Even without such vast chasms in experience, the environment of siblings is never the same. Environment has far greater impact on the structures and circuits of the human brain than was realized even a decade ago. It is what shapes the inherited genetic material. I believe it to be the decisive factor in determining whether impairments in ADD will or will not appear in a child. Many variables will influence the particular environment a child experiences. Birth order, for one, automatically places siblings into similar situations. The older sibling has to suffer the pain of seeing parental love and attention directed toward an intruder. The younger sibling may need to learn survival in an environment that harbors a stronger, potentially hostile rival and never comes to know either the special status or the burden of being an only child. The full weight of unconscious parental expectations is far more likely to fall on the firstborn. Historical studies of birth order have established it as an important influence on shaping of the personality comparable with sex. The parent's economic situation may be better around the birth of one child than when other children are born, or, as in the case of my family of origin, historical or social circumstances may have enormous consequences on the parents' emotional states and therefore on the personalities of their children. I was born in 1944 to Jewish parents in Budapest, Hungary, having made the miscalculation of entering the world 2 months before the Nazi occupation of my birthplace, over a year before the end of World War II. The first of my 2 brothers was born 2.5 years later, during a time of peace, optimism, and immense emotional relief. It goes without saying that the psychological equilibrium of my parents would have changed dramatically between my birth and that of my brother, as would the degree of anxiety they transmitted to their sons. The younger of my brothers was born in Canada, less than 2 years after our family settled here as penniless refugees. We have fled Hungary after the 1956 revolution, when my parents, then close to middle age, decided to leave the insecurities and upheavals of Eastern Europe behind forever. Fortunately, perhaps, they could not have foreseen the difficulties of adjusting to new life on a new continent. Their third son arrived in the midst of economic hardship and uncertainty about the future. My mother recalls that she wept throughout the 9 months of her pregnancy, and she still has feelings of guilt about the deep postpartum depression she suffered during the first year of her youngest son's life. 3 brothers, and I would say 3 different sets of parents. I do not believe it is coincidental that my youngest brother and I have been treated for depression and attention deficit disorder. Our middle brother has not. Even without world wars, revolutions, and immigration, siblings growing up in the same home almost never share the same environment. More accurately, brothers and sisters share some environments, usually the less important ones, but they rarely share the one single environment that has the most powerful impact on personality formation. They may live in the same house, eat the same kinds of food, partake in many of the same activities. These are environments of secondary importance. Of all environments, the one that most profoundly shapes the human personality is the invisible one, the emotional atmosphere in which the child lives during the critical early years of brain development. The invisible environment has little to do with parenting philosophies or parenting style. It is a matter of intangibles, for most among them being the parents' relationship with each other and their emotional balance as individuals. These two can vary significantly from the birth of one child to the arrival of another. Psychological tension in the parents' lives during the child's infancy is, I am concerned, a major and universal influence on the subsequent emergence of ADD. We will return to it in later chapters. A hidden factor of great importance is a parent's unconscious attitude toward a child. What or whom, on the deepest level, the child represents for the parents, the degree to which the parents see themselves in the child, the needs parents may have that they subliminally hope the child will meet. For the infant, there exists no abstract, out-there reality. The emotional milieu with which we surround the child is the world as he experiences it. In the words of the child psychiatrist and researcher Margaret Mahler, for the newborn, the parent is the principal representative of the world. To the infant and toddler, the world reveals itself in the image of the parent, in eye contact, intensity of glance, body language, tone of voice, and above all, in the day-to-day joy or emotional fatigue exhibited in the presence of the child. Whatever a parent's intention, these are the means by which the child receives his or her most formative communications. Although they will have a paramount importance for development of the child's personality, these subtle and often unconscious influences will be missed on psychological questionnaires or observations of parents in clinical settings. There is no way to measure a softening or an edge of anxiety in the voice, the warmth of a smile, or the depth of a furrow on a brow. We have no instruments to gauge the tension in a father's body as he holds his infant, or to record whether a mother's gaze is clouded by worry or clear with calm anticipation. It may be said that no two children have exactly the same parents, in that the parenting they each receive may vary in highly significant ways. Whatever the hopes, wishes, or intentions of the parent, the child does not experience the parent directly. The child experiences the parenting. I have known two siblings to disagree vehemently about their father's personality during their childhood. Neither has to be wrong if we understand that they did not receive the same fathering, which is what formed their experience of the father. I have even seen subtly but significantly different mothering given to a pair of identical twins. In the case of the Gilmores, two of the four brothers, Gary and Galen, turned out bad and came to violent ends, and the other two, Frank and Michael, with great difficulty managed to gain a sense of themselves as self-respecting human beings. When they looked back on their childhoods, Frank and Michael clearly recognized that their unfortunate siblings had been given their parents' darker sides, while they themselves received what little lightness there was in their father and mother. The effects of the environment on brain development and personality formation vary from child to child. As we see, these influences are different to begin with. They are also acting on different individuals. How the infant reacts to the environment has a major impact on the nature of his experience of the world. It would be virtually impossible for two children to inhabit the same environment, even if their worlds could be exactly matched to the minutest detail.